Hello everybody, and welcome back to another video where we're looking at another Auto 5. Auto 5s are those shotguns that were inspired by the Browning Auto 5 or derived from it, knocked off of it. And today we have a particularly interesting example. At first glance, most people just confuse this with being an actual Auto 5 or a license-produced copy like the Savage 720 or the Remington Model 11. But people who think this would be wrong. And in fact, the most interesting thing about this shotgun is it actually incorporates a couple of elements from other Auto 5s while visually externally resembling very close to a proper Auto 5. Based on the research that I've been able to do, this shotgun was not made with any permission or rights exchange or anything like that from the guns that it borrowed these elements from. Today's shotgun is the Yamamoto Pointer Auto. This was a shotgun that was made in Japan. The history on the Japanese knockoff Auto 5s, the Japanese Auto 5s, is very difficult to track down. I've got a couple of leads that ended up contradicting one another, so I don't want to present either of them as necessarily the truth. The common thread I've been able to pin down is that post-World War II, Japan, much like many of the other Axis countries, were trying to find ways to make money. In switching their military arms production into commercial arms production was one avenue that was explored for this. Of course, Japan was subject to a great number of treaties that made manufacturing arms difficult, but they could make them for export, so sporting style arms was something that they could leverage in order to make money. Now, as far as the time frame on the Pointer Auto, it seems like it was sometime between the 50s and maybe as late as the 70s. These shotguns were originally called Yamamoto Pointer Auto when they were imported into the US and other countries, like these were exported from Japan to Europe as well. And as far as I've been able to tell, I haven't been able to find the details of this lawsuit, so this is hearsay based on people who say this is how it went down, so it may be accurate, it may not be. But the story that most people seem to tell is some version of Browning and FN took offense to the fact that they were calling this Auto and the fact that it looked like an Auto 5, because of course that's a trademark problem. And because of this, the later guns were eventually had to have Auto removed from them. So you'll find earlier ones that on this side of the gun will say, Yamamoto Pointer Auto or Pointer Auto. Meanwhile, this one just says Pointer because it's one of those slightly later guns. Now, we'll go through the features of this gun a little bit later because it is actually pretty interesting. But just to wrap up the history section and to reiterate once more, finding history about these things has been pretty difficult. It seems that there was maybe one or two large firearm conglomerations in Japan that had a bunch of different companies manufacturing shotguns. There was at least two different concerns, I think, making Auto 5s, Auto 5s. But today's subject, the Yamamoto Pointer, is sort of separated from those other guns because the Yamamoto Pointer is rough around every edge on the gun. Everything about it is just a little bit poorly made. It was certainly a very intentional cost reduction version of the Auto 5, and that comes through in the fit and finish. Most of these guns you find will end up having damage on them, be in very poor condition. I've only ever seen one that came up in decent condition. It was a Charles Daly import. And for those that don't know, Charles Daly was sort of ahead of the curve of importing these Japanese shotguns because they found that even with the pointers, they are not high quality guns, but they were cheap. And they were, as far as the importer's cost, it would be like half the price of what the actual manufacturing cost of an actual Auto 5 would be because Japan's labor was so cheap at this point in time. So it made them a very cost-attractive option, and Charles Daly was ahead of the curve on noticing, hey, these are actually pretty good. I'm not going to say that Turkish shotguns are very good, but the attitude that most people have about Turkish shotguns today, that they're kind of crap and they're poorly made and cheap, most people had that opinion about Japanese shotguns in that 50s to 70s time frame. A lot of this was xenophobia. We just fought a pretty brutal war against them, and Americans had certain biases against Japanese people as a result of that. But some of that was born in the fact that some of the guns that were being imported from Japan were very low quality. And while I want to say it again, the Yamamoto Pointer is not a high-quality firearm by any stretch of the imagination. There's some people out there that say that, they break in 5 shots and they're completely horrible and useless. And that's not been my experience with this gun at all. This gun has certainly been around the block. It's got creases and dents all over the wood, but very interestingly, no cracks, which is a testament in and of itself. But it's got paint coming off of down here on the trigger guard, got wear all over the gun, we'll see as we take it apart. Additionally, out here on the tip of the barrel, our front sight bead has been replaced with a cheese head screw. A lot of the Pointer Autos I've seen have the bead come off. I assume that they were either, that was one of the things that was not very well made on these guns from the get-go. But much aside from that, these guns will be found in various states of disrepair, and the tricky thing about them is Parts compatibility with actual Auto 5s or with the guns that it borrowed elements from are very hit and miss. The furniture is unique to them, which is a big problem. So getting one to fix up probably isn't a good option, and trying to find a used one is probably only worth it to you if you don't need a shotgun and you're just trying to get the silly Japanese goof-off knockoff version of the Auto 5 that was cost reduced and sort of mixed with some elements of the Franchi. But we'll investigate that more as we take the gun apart. As usual, that first step is racking the bolt back. The one positive thing I think I can say about this gun in terms of smoothness is getting the bolt back on this thing is almost as smooth as an actual Auto 5. I've handled a couple other of these Pointer Autos and they were not quite as smooth. I'm not sure if it's because this gun is broken in well or it's not broken in enough or what, but this gun is quite smooth, all things considered, and more smooth than the typical Pointer Auto. But to go ahead and get our handguard off, it is our typical process that we've become so accustomed to, taking that cap off. And as far as this cap is concerned, they didn't mill the slots in for the cap to ratchet against on the retainer on the handguard. Instead, it's sort of like a stamped feature going on here where they took a stamping tool and stamped it all the way around. Interesting way for them to cost reduce. At one point, the outside of this cap was knurled, but somebody did the stupid thing they do with these guns where they use channel lock pliers to try and remove this cap and scratch the heck out of it because they don't have the hand strength to hold onto the pliers. So it's unfortunate, but again, finding replacement parts for these guns is a complete nightmare situation, and all things considered, having the knurling gone just makes it look a little ugly. Go ahead and slide our forend off here. Pretty typical to what we've seen before in terms of actual Auto 5, right? No reinforcement going on here. You may notice a little flash of brass going on up there. That's because this forend, much like the other Yamamoto Pointer forends I've seen, have the wood take a set. What that means is, of course, because the barrel's reciprocating inside of here, the wood will actually over time compact, right? The wood will squish in on itself, and this is particularly common with guns where, being in Japan, where would they have sourced wood from? I don't know, but it probably wasn't the French walnut that FN was using, or the high quality Turkish walnut that would be used later on with the guns. This is Lord knows what in terms of wood, and certainly these Pointer Autos woods will take a set, and then as a result of that, guns that have been shot a lot, you'll have to install a shim there in the forend. But that's a relatively easy process, and the reason that matters, of course, is because how far forward the barrel can come is set by that face on the forend, and if your barrel can come so far forward that the bolt can't lock into it, obviously that's going to cause feeding and cycling problems. And just to sort of show you guys what that wood taking a set looks like, you can actually sort of see it there on the front of the handguard, where just this cap being tight against the threads has just caused the wood to sort of creep or compress over time and over use. So that's certainly not good. You will find Belgian guns or your proper Auto 5s that have wood take a set, but I think all of the Yamamoto Pointers I've seen, the wood has taken a set. It seems to be a recurring theme for these guns, that the wood is just a little bit softer than it maybe ought to be. Additionally, no elm reinforcement inside of here, and because of that, I think we've talked about before, this ring that actually holds the handguard onto the front of the receiver is very thin. If that ring gets damaged and starts to crack, it can crack all the way up through the handguard, right? And this entire mess can just come off of there and becomes a point for the entire handguard to split apart at, because this thin ring just sort of acts as a crack initiation point. Browning would eventually put a little elm insert in this area that makes it so this crack can only go as far back as that insert, which prevents handguards from splitting in half as a result of this. Interestingly, the Yamamoto Pointers I've seen, I don't know that I've seen a lot of actual cracked handguards, and probably that owes to the fact that this wood is squishy enough that perhaps it's a little bit more pliable than hardwoods, which are a little desperate to end up splitting. But that's our forend there. I'm not going, I usually complain like these should have been reinforced, Browning should have reinforced them, and everybody that came after should have reinforced them, but I'll go ahead and give this gun a pass because this was meant to be cheapest possible Auto 5 and not best or nicest possible Auto 5. So, a cheap forend made out of cheap wood. Next up, we have ourselves a cheap barrel made the cheap way. We have a separate hanger here. I have heard and seen these hangers coming off. I don't think that these hangers were soldered particularly well. The other thing that's striking about the barrel is how heavy it feels in the hand. It's probably not immediately evident just by looking at the barrel, at least not without side by side, but the whole profile of the barrel is quite a bit thicker than you typically see. This is compounded by the fact that, of course, this is quite a long barrel. But there we have it, a very typical barrel extension. Sometimes barrels will interchange between Yamamoto's and actual Auto 5s. They were all nominally built the same, of course with just some minor differences. But there you go, nothing we really haven't seen before in terms of a brazed on rib with a brazed on barrel loop, and our very typical familiar barrel extension system. We can go ahead and set that to the side. Set it this way because I have this gun all slicked up. When I got this gun, it was in a state of hadn't been cleaned in 50 years sort of situation, and so I cleaned the heck out of it and then greased the heck out of it to ensure that it would want to work pretty well, because everything in the gun was pretty stiff. Here we have our control ring, exactly like we've seen before, friction ring, just like we've seen before, and our barrel spring. Again, we've seen all this sort of stuff before, just like an Auto 5, and in fact, the friction and spring components will interchange just fine with an Auto 5. Taking one last look over on the receiver, we'll see that while we do have the magazine tube retaining screw on this side of the gun, that screw does not have the shell cutoff like a proper Auto 5 does. So, of course, on the Remingtons and the Savages, that screw was on this side. The Brownings, it's on this side, and it holds on that assembly for the magazine cutoff. Obviously, no magazine cutoff on this gun. Another thing you'll run into with these Yamamoto pointers, not dissimilar to the Franchi 48s, is you'll find some Franchi 48s that have a loose magazine tube. Tightening the magazine tube on a Franchi 48 isn't terribly difficult. You need some pliers, need some screwdrivers, need some time and attention. Tightening the mag tubes on these guns is quite a bit more difficult because they are retained the same way as the Brownings. Of course, the Franchis just sort of have like a key lock system, where this gun uses a screw more or less as a retaining pin. Because of that, tightening the mag tube on these guns involves taking the screw out, advancing the tube, and of course you can't just clamp on this tube with a vise. You have to use soft jaws. You have to use a block inside of the receiver and then make a tool that lets you twist on the receiver without twisting, bending the receiver. Because the hoop at the top of the receiver is thin enough, you can bend these receivers when trying to tighten magazine tubes in. But with that work done, I got the magazine tube on this gun tightened up. When it came to me, that tube was loose enough on there. I was concerned that eventually the tube was going to damage its threads, and then the tube was going to come off the front of the gun, cause all sorts of trouble. But I got that tightened up, and again, it was so loose that I didn't have to move to an oversized screw. I could take the screw out, take the tube, and the tube went about more than 1/8 of a rotation. It went a long way, and then I could drill a new divot for the screw to sit into and put the screw back in there. That's obviously a lot more involved process than the Franchi, because the Franchi is sort of meant to be, it's not meant to be adjusted, but it is retightenable. This system isn't meant to be retightenable. Across all of the Pointer Autos that I've seen, every single one had some amount of wobble in the mag tube. I don't think it's beneficial for that to ever be there. If it was beneficial for that to be there, Browning would have made it that way. I think that that's just one of the things about these guns that was poorly made. It wouldn't surprise me if they made these mag tubes and tried to time the threads on the tubes to the receiver. You just had one machine set up to do them and do them and do them and do them. And they put this hole in the same place to sort of retain them so that they didn't have to put tubes on receivers and then get the hole lined up and then drill the hole and then take it out and get the chips out and then reapply coatings if they were so inclined, then put the tube back in, then put the screw in. That's way too much manufacturing work for the cheapest possible Auto 5. If you could just put that hole in the mag tube at the time that you manufactured the mag tube, screw it in there and then sink the screw in, and if the mag tube wobbles, that's whatever. I think that's sort of the approach that they went with these. But with that discussed, right, that's one thing to watch out for with these guns is mag tube wobble is never good with these guns, because eventually a wobbly mag tube will cause binding, it'll cause the barrel to start gouging the tube, or the tube just wobbles enough that it breaks off in here in the base, and then the whole front end of your gun goes flying out and it's kind of silly looking. Now, moving on back, we have a very familiar receiver setup, right? Our lock screws for our carrier, our screws for our trigger plate, all stuff that we've seen before. The sort of thing we haven't seen before, though, at least not on a gun that looks like this, is no tang on the top, no tang on the bottom. Instead, this receiver is much more Franchi shaped. It's just completely, so it's got the Browning humpback on a receiver that's otherwise a Franchi footprint. So, of course, the Franchi has not as much of a hump going on in the back there, right? They've muted the hump on the Franchi, but the Franchi is no tang and no tang. And on this gun, we're missing the tangs. So taking the stock off on this gun involves undoing the butt plate and then taking the stock off that way. I'll go ahead and show you guys that just because it's different than an Auto 5, whereas on an actual Auto 5 getting the stock off is just a lock screw and then a screw that sits through the wrist of the stock, and you pull the stock off. It's pretty convenient not having to take the butt pad on and off constantly, but again, if you're making cheap as possible Auto 5, this is certainly the better way to do it. We'll turn to our little screwdriver kit here. Let's see if we can't find a screwdriver bit that's a decent fit for our stock. That's the one. Take a quick look here. I do have the original butt plate on this gun. It's not very common to find the original butt plates without any cracks, and I've sort of told myself that I won't shoot this gun much more without printing a replacement butt plate for this gun so I can take the original out of service, because most of these do end up cracking. But the butt plate also came with this little white liner. Maybe this was advertised as a spacer, but I think really what it's there to do is just make the gun look more expensive than it is by having this white line at the back. Sort of evokes a tuxedo look or something, is I'm sure what they're going for there. Set the screws for that to the side, and now up inside the butt end of the stock we have a bolt that goes to the back of the action spring tube, so we'll have to get a tool down there and pop the stock off. And mercifully it is simply a 19mm socket to get the stock off of this thing. And I say mercifully as opposed to flathead screw systems I never like in stocks like these. The hex nut system just works a lot better, and while it is slightly more expensive, right, here's one way that this gun isn't just made as cheap as possible. It certainly was a decent place for them to try and spend the money to make the gun just a little bit better. And with our stock removed, we can take a look at it. Because there isn't really any inletting, right, there's just this hole for the nut and washer to go into, this is a really, really heavyweight stock. I can't imagine it wanting to crack, at least not through its width, just given how awfully beefy it is. But one thing that you can look at in terms of build quality is look at how well centered that hole is. They didn't use a jig or a tool to do that. I think they sent that by eye. They just sort of looked at it and went, yep, that's about right, because that hole is like more than 1/10 of an inch off center. It's pretty bad. But looking here at the front of the stock, it's certainly a little bit of Franke inspiration going on up here. Certainly wouldn't surprise me if they had seen a Franke, and that's where they sort of got the idea to do this specific system from. But there's our stock, and just to show, here is our nut and our washer. As this gun came to me, it just had the nut straight onto a lock washer like this. Obviously, that's not ideal. You'd normally want a flat washer between these two so that the lock washer doesn't try and beat up this nut. However, this is how the gun came to me. I don't know if maybe a washer was originally included and lost, but at least I think I've only ever checked actually one other Pointer Auto, and it was in the same configuration, right? No flat washer involved at all. So hard to say, but certainly whenever I will reinstall that, I'll put a little bit of grease on it to try and avoid the tendency for the two parts to grind against each other. For our next steps of disassembly, you have the option of trying to undo the bolt now, but we will do that in a moment. What I will do next is take these screws out here. Across all the Pointer Autos I've seen, they did not really have matched screws. You can see some of them will sometimes about line up, but that's about it. No other configuration of swatching screws around on this gun will get them all to line up like you can get on Brownings. And I don't think that's because this gun had replacement screws, because again, replacement parts for these guns is all but impossible to actually find. Now, on the topic of screws, one of the other tricky things about the Pointer Autos is that the size of the slots on these screws is different than the Brownings, and it's not different in a good way. These are all about 10 thou slots in each of these screws, so use of a regular screwdriver on these screws will certainly bugger them up. I'm of two minds about this. One mind is that slot is way too small and it just tends to want to make screwdriver tips break. However, these slots being so small means that you're going to tend to get people to avoid using their regular, angled tip screwdrivers and buggering up the screws, because they can't even get a screwdriver to fit into these screws to bugger them up in the first place. But we will go ahead, run around and get all of our screws out. And with those two screws out, we can take our trigger group. We'll look at that now before we get the carrier out of the gun. Very interesting things going on here with the trigger group. Of note, we have an out of battery safety, much like we do with the typical Auto 5. And no, this isn't an auto battery safety that impinges on the disconnector. People do like to ask that sort of a question, but that is not how this out of battery system actually works on this gun. It is just like on the typical Auto 5, except that on the typical Auto 5, the unit is actually mounted further over here, and it just has this tang here. So they certainly changed how it works as a part of having this cast aluminum trigger guard unit. Otherwise, the fire control group is pretty much just like you'd find on an Auto 5, except we've gotten rid of the flat spring and moved to the plunger coil spring system that, as far as I'm aware, first shows up on the 1148, but certainly could have shown up before then, in terms of shotgun design anyway. Additionally, while our trigger is that Browning double hook system, it is slightly different in that the trigger is certainly further rearward positioned, but it does work much the same way, where the hammer itself is, the disconnector is fixed to the trigger, right? You've got two hooks on the trigger, but it's actually the hammer that acts as the disconnecting member, because it's able to float up and down like so. The hammer has an ovular hole that it rides in. So whenever the hammer comes back after having been fired, it is able to shift forward and then get pushed back upwards by the spring to sit underneath the disconnector until you release the trigger. Very simple fire control group compared to some of the others that we've seen, especially because this is true to life, just like an Auto 5, only really different in its manufacturing approach. Its function is pretty much the same, but for this plunger and spring system going on here, right? We've gotten rid of the flat spring that we so love from the actual Auto 5. The spring for the carrier rides on the fire control group here. The original Auto 5s did not have a system like this. The Auto 5 would eventually switch to a system like this, where the spring then rides on here. But again, not a lot to really talk about here, other than it's obviously thickened up in key areas because it's cast out of aluminum, and I'm sure the Japanese were aware of their own inadequacy when it came to manufacturing things out of aluminum. So you have a much chunkier trigger guard than you would find otherwise. Can set that to the side, get some of our tools put away, get our screws set over, and with that trigger group discussed, we can go ahead and get the carrier out of the gun next. This comes out just like an Auto 5. One screw there. Of note, these screws are not straight up compatible with Auto 5. You could probably force them to work, but the pins are actually slightly longer, as I seem to recall. Taking the other screw out. And with that done, the carrier will pop right out of the bottom of the gun. Things to note, right, it's this one-piece carrier design. You can probably see, hopefully the camera will pick up some of this detail. It's a very, very cast part. You can certainly see a lot of the casting marks. We'll get ourselves a rag here and maybe wipe it clean. Maybe able to see that even more. Again, this was not the best quality Auto 5. This was the cheapest made Auto 5. And you can certainly see that in the overall presentation of the parts. A lot of very obviously cast stuff going on. There's chatter marks here like it was done by a die grinder. There's grind marks here. This was definitely done by a grinder. Just clearances cut into the part that weren't worth the time to put it on a rigid machine. It's just sort of nyomp, nyomp, nyomp done by hand to get the gun to fit together. Certainly a little bit more old world in that approach, but there was a time when labor was cheaper than machines, and so this was the cheap way to make a gun. Typically not so anymore. But at this point, we really just have the bolt group left in the gun. Of course, if you wanted to take this apart like a Browning, you do have these pins that you can use to take out the shell stop and the bolt stop, but we will not do that for this video because that's more or less the same process. Roll pins on this gun. I don't know that I've checked all of the other Pointer Autos to see if they're roll pins or screws, but this gun is roll pins. I'm assuming they would all be roll pins because, again, that's way cheaper than doing the screws like Browning had done initially. With that addressed, we are ready to take the action spring out of the gun. One tricky thing about these is that because the action spring sits a little bit recessed, you kind of need to use a tool to catch it, or else it will go flying. So we'll ease it out there. And we can see the relatively ingenious action spring plug that I came up with. This gun did not originally have an action spring plug whatsoever. It probably needs one because otherwise this spring is just resting on this pin, and that's not great. And so I could have printed one, but then I sat there looking at my pile of scrap parts, and I was like, huh, I bet that works really well. And I went and found I went and got a picture of the original action spring plug and got a length measurement, and this is just about right. So funnily enough, that's what I'm using, at least for now, at least until I can be bothered to get the full set of dimensions for an original one so I can copy that. But otherwise, there is that assembly, seriously over-oiled by whatever dummy was in here messing with this gun earlier. But that's about all there is to see there. And as far as my justification for having over-oiled the heck out of this thing, it was seriously gritty and in a state of disrepair whenever I got it. And I went with the some is good, more is better approach to lubricating it. Looking at the back of the receiver here, right, it is sort of funky to see an Auto 5 with no tang that has just the whole way this is set up is just a little bit trippy to look at when you're so used to looking at Auto 5s. But the receiver extension, they're silver soldered on. It's just an interesting way to have cost simplified as much of this gun as they did. One thing I would like to note that they didn't cost save on that they certainly could have is the lightning cuts inside the receiver. The Auto 5 has a series of lightning cuts, and it will have, depending on the model of Auto 5, it'll have more or less lightning cuts. Like the Light 12 is maximized lightning cuts and putting lightning cuts on hammers and stuff to try and cut weight out of the gun. This gun, as far as I can tell, I obviously haven't measured all of the cuts, but this gun has most of the Light 12 cuts in the receiver, and that's definitely not something that they needed to do to make the gun as cheap as possible. Now, of course, you're in there with keyway cutters to be cutting a bunch of features anyway, and you have the receiver fixtured like this to cut those, so it certainly wouldn't hurt to go ahead and do a little bit of weight reduction since you've already got it fixtured up on the machine, but it is at least nice to see that even on a gun they were trying to make as cheap as possible, they were at least paying some attention to avoiding having the gun weigh, in excess of 8.5 pounds, 9 pounds, really heavy, but they did avoid that here. And now for the final step of disassembly, we will take the bolt group out of the gun. This is done much like with a typical Auto 5. You will line up the disassembly pin in the bolt group with this U-shaped notch, and then drive the pin through from this side. And this is something that sometimes just gives a little bit of trouble. With our punches, got it set up on a punch block so we don't beat things up too much. This pin comes really easy. On a lot of the Auto 5s, this pin will be a taper pin that's in there unbelievably tight. There's a couple Auto 5s I've got that I could prove had never been taken apart, and that taper pin was in there hard enough it needed to be taken out with a press. There's not really a good reason this pin needs to be a taper pin because it's not actually able to walk out of either side of the gun, any more so than a 1911's slide stop pin is able to walk out technically as you're firing it. It could come out on its own, but it doesn't because it's being held in there. It's at its forwardmost position, it's held in there. At its backwardsmost position, it's held in there. Whenever it's sliding between the two, it's not having a load trying to kick it out of the gun. So on the original Auto 5s, this did not need to be a taper pin, but it certainly was on those, but it is not here. This is a straight pin that behaves very well and just comes right out. There we have our pin. And actually looking at the head of it, this was meant to be a taper pin at one point in time. You can see they, instead of making it a taper pin, they just bent the head on it, which is another way to like make the effect of a taper pin. But that pin just came out of there with the lightest of pressure. There is our carrier latch, our spring for the carrier latch, and now we can take the bolt group forward, kick the link down, kick the charging handle back, and we're ready to take the bolt group out of the gun. And this is, again, extremely oily. The one reason I wanted to take the gun this far apart is really just to show you, whereas on the typical Auto 5 you have another taper pin that sits back here to retain the firing pin, they actually did it quite a bit different here on the Yamamoto by having a pin come from above to retain the firing pin like so. And this is a roll pin, right? It's nothing too crazy. But because of this, the firing pin is actually just a typical cylindrical shape. It's almost reminiscent in shape of an AR-15 firing pin. And you get away from that stupid square-shaped lug on the back of the Auto 5 firing pin that, frankly, is not a very manufacturable design. But one really cool thing about the Pointer is that they still bothered to put the secondary extractor on here. Again, most of the things on this gun tend in the direction of being the cheapest possible gun, but this was a added cost thing that they didn't have to do. You can make long recoil guns work fine with just one extractor, but they are better with two. The bad news is, so far as I remember, neither of these extractors will direct swap with an Auto 5. They can be made to work with Auto 5 extractors should either of these break, but they are not one-for-one copies of the Auto 5 in that regard. But otherwise, there's your bolt group. You can see even since I oiled it, there's still been grime working its way off the gun. I have shot this one a little bit because, of course, I got it in such a state of disrepair. It was cheap, got it fixed up, and I didn't believe it would actually cycle. And I probably put 200 or 300 rounds through the thing, and it has just run like a dream. No jams, no trouble. It's smooth. It's comfortable to shoot, which is hard to believe because that's even the original friction ring system in that gun. I didn't put a new spring or new rings in the gun because they felt tight, and then you went to shoot it and they were tight. So that is certainly a testament to the gun may have been made cheap. There may have been a lot of design changes to make the gun cheap, but they didn't design liabilities into the gun. They didn't like skimp out on the design such that the gun is a piece of shit, except for in the few ways that it is, right? The wood certainly makes the gun a piece of shit. Some of the way the parts fit together is either too loose for my liking or too tight for my liking, but all that really comes out in the wash because the guns do fire and perform well. I won't take that roll pin out now because, again, everything we've seen past that point, right, it's a cylindrical firing pin. You guys know what that looks like. And otherwise, this is just pretty typical Auto 5. One other little interesting thing to note, though, is that there's a roll pin here for the link between our carrier tail and our locking block. I'm not a giant fan of that because there is a non-zero amount of force being transmitted through that pin, and that's not what roll pins are for. A little bit of a sketchy thing going on there, but I've seen on two different guns, they both had this. This was factory so far as I can tell, the use of a roll pin there. A little bit sketchy, and certainly if it breaks, I will hastily replace it with a tight-fitting solid pin. But for now, it does work okay, right? Like I said, a couple hundred rounds through the gun, and it's just been chugging along fine. And with that bolt group discussed, we can look up into the receiver, but spoiler alert, it's really just a regular Auto 5. There's nothing extra cool or interesting to see here at all. And with that, we're pretty much ready to just go ahead and do our fast-forward reassembly process of the gun, because at the end of the day, this is a really close to an Auto 5. For our Auto 5s, this is really darn close to being an Auto 5. Really, the cheap differences are in just a couple of places that they did cost savings, the way the stock is held on, a couple of things about the bullet group. The fire control group, pretty significantly cost reduced here compared to the way Browning did it. The removal of the tangs is certainly a cost reduction thing, but otherwise it's most of the way there. And I don't hate the gun because of that. We'll save my final closing thoughts for the very end of the video, but before that, let's go ahead and get this thing thrown back together. with that done, we have our gun back together, bolt moving just the way it should. And of course, as a reminder, we will have a shooting segment about this gun specifically in its own separate video. Again, we're doing that so that we can focus for the tabletop more on the gun itself, and then for the shooting, more on the shooting the gun itself, and we can keep those conversations related to each other, but distinct, so that it can avoid, A, repeating things unnecessarily, but then also B, keeping things a little bit more in context. But as far as our closing thoughts here on the Yamamoto Pointer, I want to reiterate that I don't think these are good guns. These are poor, cost-reduced quality Auto 5s. Everything about them is made cheaper. However, some things about them are made maybe slightly smarter, just with lower quality materials all around. You will find things on the internet that say that these guns don't work, or that they're unsafe, or they're unreliable, or they break parts constantly, or straight up unsafe. I've seen unsafe claimed. Not been my experience at all. I've handled a couple of them and talked to several more people who do own them. They're not terribly uncommon guns to come across. As far as I can tell, a couple 100,000 maybe made it into the United States, with a couple 100,000 more being out there all around the world, and then some of those still get imported in the United States every now and then. But not terribly uncommon guns. And the people I've talked to's experience is pretty much mirrored mine, where it's got loose magazine tubes, the wood is made very poorly, all of the fit and finish is just a little bit kind of not great, but they do work. And in my case, it's been superbly reliable, right? Yet to have a malfunction with the gun whatsoever. And I want to reiterate that at least this particular example shoots really smooth. I've talked to other people whose examples don't shoot smooth at all. But this particular one, the friction system does a good job of working like it's supposed to. Even when it's greased, it's got a rather tight friction system, but the gun is nice in that regard. I'm not saying that if you go out and buy one, it'll be that way, because some of the other people, again, I've talked to that have these, that's not been the case. And I would generally not assume it to be the case with as slipshod as the quality control on these things is. What with loose magazine tubes is really unacceptable. But that's pretty much it. I like the way it shoots. It's heavy. It does balance okay. Like a lot of the Japanese shotguns, the stock comb is a little bit tall for my liking. Of course, they've got different shaped faces, generally speaking, than white Americans do. So the stock is not necessarily going, the stock that fits them is not really going to be the same general stock that fits Americans. The same way that American Auto 5 stocks are generally longer in length of pull than the European Auto 5 stocks, because Americans were generally taller by the time the gun was very popular. So a couple of factors to sort of pay attention to there is that even if you do get one, if you have cheekbones that are shaped a particular way, the stock just may not fit you whatsoever, which can make the gun either very painful or impossible to actually shoot effectively. So thing to keep in mind there, thing to keep in mind with the wood, right? It's not replaceable. Eventually, yeah, I know, I keep saying this, but eventually I'll come up with printable versions of a lot of the different sets of furniture, because that's sort of really the only option, the only viable option, I think, to keep things like this in service, because getting somebody with a router to go and make you a set of these is kind of a ridiculous thing, because the wood cost before any work is done on it would cost more than these guns themselves do. Just for that good hardwood blanks is going to cost more than this entire gun's worth, so generally not going to be worth it. But for printing, right, it's like a $5 foreign and a $5 stock, and you can use the thing again, and at that point I think is a pretty cost-attractive option. So I will be working on that eventually, as well as furniture sets for as many of these silly things that I've talked about that I can end up pulling off. But that's the Yamamoto Pointer. It, by all means, is the cheapest possible Auto 5, not Auto 5, but it does work, and I want that to be the chief takeaway. Is no reason you should want to run out and buy these unless you want the cheap Auto 5, right, the poorly made one, that does still manage to work, in my case, well, in most other cases, at least acceptably, as far as actual verified reports of people who have gone and shot theirs. Now, I appreciate you guys sticking to the end of the video. If you liked this video or like this sort of video, I've got more Auto 5s to talk about. I've got more other kinds of shotguns to talk about, too. Shotguns in general interest me. Of course, the object of my obsession is the long recoil ones, but I do like other sorts of shotguns as well. We'll have more videos about those coming up soon here eventually. If you would like to support me, you can join on the Patreon, and I will try and get in a better habit of doing polls as far as seeing what you guys want to see next in terms of a shotgun video, just because I've got so many of them, and I know some of them are particularly really interesting shotguns. At least I think they're really interesting. And if you guys want me to prioritize that video, I really have no agenda or schedule at this point. because I've learned of so many of these other, I've learned of more Auto 5s that I don't have, that I have plans to get, that threw off the whole schedule. I had a planned out schedule, the order that I was going to do these things in, and that's completely out the window at this point. So if you join the Patreon, in addition to perks such as early access to videos, you'll be able to participate in those polls and help influence through democracy what videos come next. Of course, if you do a higher tier and then you suggest it more heavily in the comments, then you can do this deluxe democracy, the democracy $ democracy, the deluxe one, ultra deluxe, and then you could influence it that way as well. If there's a particular shotgun that you're really burning to see taken apart or learn more about or hear my musings on. But all that said, I hope you guys have a nice time. I hope you guys appreciate the other Japanese Auto 5, the other Japanese Auto 5, the other, oh my god, you guys wouldn't believe how many of these guns there are. But we will get to them all in due time, and I hope you all have a nice day.